Good to know.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for bearing with us through the start time and everything. So thank you. My name is Amy Schwartz. I am a designer here in Chicago, and last year I started a strange amorphous series of events and happenings called Liminal Space, which really seeks to bring people together in new ways to make work, talk about work, and explore where design overlaps with other arenas like art and publishing, writing, etc. So we've had a few events, and over the past few months we've had Cameron here as our resident in the office, our designer in residence. He's been exploring a lot of interesting themes, which he will talk about today. But we wanted to put together another event that brings people together to discuss these themes and further connect people in the city of Chicago. So thank you so much for coming. Hopefully you enjoy it, and I'll let Cameron from here.
I guess as a way of intro, I kind of just want to go back over the questions that we asked at the start of the symposium. Like when we first came up with this idea, I wrote a small text and I sent it out to people who I thought would be interested to talk about this sort of theme. So I suppose I'll just read this back to you. Most of it was in the event page, if anyone read that. So how do you produce or find content in your work? How do we as graphic designers, writers, artists, etc. create content beyond often arbitrary definitions of practice? Do our definitions, designer, writer, artist, etc. affect the way that we work? I've been wondering a lot why it is that design talks are often less interesting than artist talks. I don't think it has to do with the work itself being uninteresting. Is there a mentality of designers as producers instead of content creators that affects the discourse created around work produced? What does it mean for graphic designers to create their own content? What does it mean to work between disciplines? I keep hearing the sentence as blank, I blank. What does it mean to produce work from your practice? Where do you situate yourself? Is it important to make the distinction when a graphic designer creates content? Is there a designerly way of creating that responds to tools, software, history, business models, aesthetics, language, politics, etc. of graphic design practice? What of non-designers who create what might be identifiable as designerly work? What is the role of research in contemporary practice? So much as any event like this is going to be about words, I think it's also important that we are conscious that nowadays it's almost impossible to hold anything down for a period of time. I don't expect to answer or come close to most of the amorphous questions, but I think it'll be interesting to hear from a range of practices as to how they create work. You're invited to speculate on the why and how of content creation, and if these are created somehow. So the way that the evening is going to work is that there's going to be 2 panels of speakers. Each speaker will get about 10 minutes each to talk, and then we'll have a 20 to 30 minute discussion amongst the panel, and the audience is also welcome to ask questions. So we'll just chat, speculate, and feel free to, during this time, just to throw out any ideas or things that you want to say. So yeah, there'll be a bit of a break in between the 2 panels, and then there'll be a bit of a longer break, and then I'm also going to do a talk, which would be about 20 minutes as well at the end. So I guess we'll just run straight into panel 1.
Yeah, so for the first panel, I think we're going to just have more of a conversation instead of the 10 minutes each. Some of us have some things prepared though, so let's come on up, my group. I'll introduce everyone. Oh no, we're all friends. This is great. So before we go ahead and get into it, introduce ourselves. Since this is a nice intimate group, I'm going to be moderating the discussion, but whatever questions you have that you want to ask, please join in and feel free to interrupt me. This is the only time in my life I'm interrupted by people. So yeah, let's just make this a great conversation. So like I said, I'm Amy Schwartz. I am a practicing designer here, and I'll let all of us introduce ourselves, and we'll take it from there.
Cool. My name's Kouri. I'm a working artist in the city. I studied graphic design at Columbia College. When I moved here, I knew I didn't have enough money to finish school, so I took as many design classes as I could and kind of jumped out into the getting a job and realized that 16 to 18 hours a day on a computer was not what I wanted to be doing. So slowly been kind of pivoting towards more fine art work practice. And I've been independent contractor for about 8 years now. How's that?
That's good.
Excellent.
Hey, I'm James. Man, I really hate labels, so this is gonna suck. By day I do mostly digital design work for my company of one, the studio James C. Green. But primarily what I do is digital-based artwork. So I'll do things like creating social justice-based work using websites, manipulating social media code, and creating like interactive art pieces for people. And in between that, I do a lot of writing. I have a strong writing practice and a podcast practice. So.
Hey, I'm Rachel. Jack of all trades, master of none. I realized the name of that TV show came from that. It was like a big moment for me. In realizing that.
I'm just realizing.
Yeah,
Crazy, right?
Way
I was like,
more.
oh, that sounds familiar.
Maybe I heard you.
Yeah, so by day I'm a software developer, work for an agency developing mobile apps. When I'm not doing that, I have writing, publishing based stuff, mostly in terms of my own writing. I do poetry, publishing. I have a couple projects. I have a journal that publishes poetry and fiction and I guess creative nonfiction now. I have a Chicago-focused project that's collecting works about the different Chicago neighborhoods. And then I guess I tweet a lot. That's part of my practice too.
Yeah.
Gotta throw that out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's me.
All right. So James, you already said that you hate labels before we even asked you to label things, which brings up the interesting question of what words you use to describe not yourself but also the work that you make, and if those words matter and why. That's for everyone.
I don't want you to shy away from the conceptual artist label because I think
Yeah.
that really defines a lot of your practice.
Yeah, that's probably the one label I'm like the most comfortable with, like conceptual art, because it seems to encapsulate a lot of different, like a very multidisciplinary practice, because it's more like the concept is the main thing, and then like the material comes later, and that's kind of like how I see when I work on projects that can blend between art and design, in a way, like especially like when I have like projects that might come off as like, oh, this is a designer project, but no, the meaning behind it is very art focused.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you feel like when you say conceptual artist, people don't assign any materials to it, but designer inherently has material or form assigned to it?
Oh yeah. Like it's almost one of the things where, okay, you're a designer, but then it's like immediate, you're making something on a computer, at least now, which kind of really ruins that whole thing, especially with conceptual art, because it can literally be the materials, whatever. It sucks. I don't like it.
Graphic design is almost like a medium at this point now,
Yeah.
rather than right? Like, you're an oil painter, you're a collage artist, you're a graphic designer. They're all artists, but it's just the medium, you know?
But do you ever find it weird when like you go to like an opening and you meet somebody, like a new artist, and they're just immediately like, I am a oil painter, or I make objects.
No, I
You know what
love
I mean?
meeting people like
People
that.
say
That
that.
Oh, yeah.
answer, that
Oh,
answer
yeah.
comes so easily to someone. I'm really intrigued by that
Yeah,
person because the focus is not something that I feel comforting in my practice. You know what I mean? Like for me, and I 2 or 3 years ago, I would have loved to own the conceptual artist name. Like it's makes a lot of sense for me. Like I introduce myself as a working artist, and I kind of make this deliberate difference between a working artist and an exhibiting artist, where traditionally an exhibiting artist, that's how you made a living. It was like this romantic vision of just like putting art on a wall and people buy it, and that's how you sustain yourself. And no longer is that really a sustainable practice, to just be exhibiting. So for me, a working artist really entails utilizing skills within an art practice in order to get commissioned work, whether it's curatorial work or graphic design work or art commissions, but really having that commercial art kind of background in order to put together proposals, write grants, set deadlines, and meet them, and be able to communicate with people. So for me, that working artist title feels right today. Who knows about tomorrow?
Yeah.
But
I was going to add in that I do ceramics, so obviously everyone dabbles in everything else, but almost every idea that I do is mitigated by material.
Yeah.
So I'm very comfortable in saying I do ceramics,
Right.
because my association with clay is intimate and tactile and daily. So
yeah.
But do you ever find that like kind of awkward if, for instance, you find yourself like interested in a new material, and you like, let's say you've been working on a new body of work that is completely divorced from ceramics, would you still call yourself like, I am a ceramic artist?
I mentioned the term dabble.
Mhm.
I feel so tied to ceramics. I just can't imagine that possible.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a material that's just in me. I'd love to do printmaking. I have a little press that I need to repair, but that would be a side project.
Mm-hmm.
I have a day job too, right? I don't consider that part of that's my day job. So printmaking would be a side project.
Right.
Ceramics is, so it's not awkward for me because it's been too long.
Yeah, I remember I had like that same kind of awkward distinction, because I remember when I was first starting on art, I was like I was a new media artist, like that was it, like stamped down, done. And then I started doing like installation work, and I was like, oh, what do I call myself then?
An old media artist.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the best way I've heard it is Martine Sims. She calls herself a conceptual entrepreneur, which is like, damn it, I wish I thought of that first. Because she dabbles in graphic design, film, audio, writing, like it's the whole thing. And I feel like she's like owned that to the point where it's like, nobody can take that.
I feel like that term, like, I kind of recoil a little bit of that term. I feel bad because,
Yeah.
like, well, I don't know who said it, and it seems like you have, like, positive associations toward it, but, like, I think that whole, just the, like, branding of entrepreneur gets it, like, what's at stake or whatever, like, when we're talking about the, like, ways we talk about ourselves and, like, describe ourselves in our own practice, like, one of the things I was thinking about a lot leading up to this is, like, why are these questions important? Like, why does it matter that you call yourself a conceptual artist and I call myself a writer or a publisher or whatever? And I feel like that, like, branding and that self-branding and sort of, like, selling yourself and making yourself, like, legible in a way to people who might, be giving you work or commissioning work from you, is important. Like, you have to, like, make yourself understood and make yourself legible to, like, be able to, like, get by and to be able to, like, get business or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like more market focused, right? Like
Yeah.
entrepreneur says to me that they're focused on the sellability of whatever they're making.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. I mean, I think commerce should be introduced more in the conversation about art.
Absolutely.
Which like kind of leads into why art and design is seen as so separate. It's like design is a clear commerce-driven field versus art, where it's like you get surprised when you say, "Oh, I got paid to do this thing," which shouldn't be that way.
There's, like, a weird, like, schizophrenia almost about, like, money in the art world.
Yeah. Like it doesn't
But-
exist.
Yeah, but it's really, like, funding everything,
Yeah,
right?
it's like the difference between not existing and being infinite too. Like the
Yeah.
market in the art
Yeah.
market is like arbitrarily infinite. I feel like for a certain aspect of it, but there's a lot of baggage with like the word entrepreneur for sure. I totally
Yeah.
agree, especially within like the startup
Mm-hmm.
culture.
Yeah, and I think, like, sorry.
Oh no.
I think, like, there's positive aspects to it too, like someone that's sort of, like, forging their own way and just, like, tying things together and doing things, originally that haven't been done a certain way, but, like, that tone, like, that term, I guess, always, like, comes tainted with these undertones of, like, the sordid side of the startup world and of like the neoliberal economy or whatever that I think like it's hard to like detangle.
Yes. And that's why like I really like how she owns it, because like I'm not speaking for her obviously, but like, you know, she's a black woman that's making art that people are buying. And it's almost like I'm going to be reclaiming this word and switching around from what you think of when you hear entrepreneur. Like when you hear entrepreneur, you probably think stock photo of like a white guy in a suit shaking a hand furiously. You know what I mean? It's like, so I don't know. I like the word.
I think it's important taking a step back though before I lose this thought, but it's important to say that if someone says they're a painter or a conceptual artist now, that those identifiers aren't fixed. And so to say that you're a conceptual artist today, 2015, doesn't mean the same as it did a decade ago, 20 years ago, or a painter even, or a ceramicist. There are a set of discourse and problems and questions that are being asked constantly. And so to say it's usually tethered to the academy, but those concerns are in flux, and they don't just stay in a conventional historical dialogue in the past. They're ever moving. So I think the threat that someone says, I'm a painter, well, that's an opening for a really rich conversation about what is painting's dialogue now. What's that discourse? And so that to me is aside, I totally agree, but aside from anything entrepreneurial, and it's much more about being beholden to history.
Yeah, because I immediately think of like a conceptual artist decades ago would be thought of as Duchamp, you know, like defining that, and even painting to the date. Like now, like a lot of things are happening in the painting world where a lot of painters are making work about painting, and like kind of blurring the lines of like using digital medium as painting and calling that painting.
Right.
Like a lot of like conceptual painters, especially like right here in Chicago, are kind of challenging the notion of painter as still life, you know?
Yeah, and I would say like I know people who are consider themselves doing radical craft versus craft and ceramics, and totally opposing dialogues on general premise of their engagement with politics, and that's awesome, and there's room, you know, there's certainly room for those places. Anyway, that was a long comment, sorry.
Oh, that was great. So it seems like we're determining that these labels don't exist so much to fulfill like how you see yourself, but more to find your larger context in your community and your audience and who you're interacting with. So that brings up the point of who do you consider your audience to be, and how did you find them?
Well, for me, at one point in my making career, I had to make a choice between getting my work in front of as many people as possible and getting my work in front of people, less people, but more appropriate audiences, right? And what is more, personally for me, more viable is I want to make my work accessible to everyone, but it's not for anyone. You know, like if you want to engage and have a conversation with the work, I make that possible, but if you don't, that's your choice as well. I think especially as going through school and it being a younger designer, I think the mentality was, all right, I'm going to make as much work as possible. I'm going to get it in front of as many people as possible. And then it actually started to dilute the kind of work that I was making because I wasn't really emotionally connected to the things that I was making. So I had to make a choice to, maybe I was doing a broader range of things, but I would only put a certain kind of work like in my portfolio on my website, the kind of work that I want to do again. And I mean, I've done everything from door-to-door salesman to busboy to I've made a website or two, which I will probably never do again because I'm no good at it. But just I constantly go back to this point of like, oh, what do you do? I was like, oh, whatever I can convince someone to pay me for. And then balancing that with the things that are emotionally rewarding for what I do. You know, like I'll take a month at an advertising agency so that I can fund the framing and publishing of a solo show that I'm working on, you know. So it's all about, like, for me, hitting a balance between the work that I find emotional rewarding and the work that I find financially rewarding, you know.
And do you ever find like folks that really kind of grasp onto your like aesthetic or style, like they end up being a bigger fan of it?
Because
like they can kind of sense the emotion that you're putting behind like it's like something that you really believe in versus the kind of like mass market.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's come with doing a lot of work and then self-curating the things that I feel like I'm emotionally invested in, and then putting them together in a way for people to be able to digest them in a way. I mean, Max Temkin, who is here, has been a huge supporter of mine for a number of years, and if because of the aesthetic and the perspective that I bring to the work, and like there's this difference also between like social support and financial support. You know, Chicago has a ton of social support for a creative community, but very narrow financial support for what we're making. So navigating that too has been interesting. You know, and finding those people that fall in the middle where they're not only in it to buy your work just to put it in a flat file for 30 years to hope that they could sell it for 5 figures, and the people that truly believe in your practice and want to help fund it and support it. And those, I feel like those people are really few and far between, and finding those kind of people within your practice is a really long-term goal. You know, I feel like I find 1 or 2 of those kinds of people like every couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
You want to talk about your audience or how you define them? How
Yeah,
you found
yeah.
them?
I mean, it's kind of very similar to Chad, where it's kind of like, I used to be really worried about like hitting as many people as possible, until I realized that like niches are really, really great. And then between that and then like I've really been into the 1,000 fans rule. Are you familiar with that?
I am. Do you want to explain it for?
Oh yeah. So I can't remember where it was linked on, but if you Google 1,000 true fans, somebody wrote about it like a couple of years ago, and it was built on the premise that like if you make something or like have a style of making and 1,000 people are right behind you on it, then you will be able to be sustainable in said practice, because it's almost that thing where it's like if you can get 1,000 people that whenever you say you're making something and then they can immediately kind of want to rally behind it and share it and buy it, then you can have a sustainable thing. So I've been really kind of using that as a funnel whenever I create something and thinking about it in that type of way. Like, I think the biggest thing I could think of is the podcast that I have. It's very, very niche. It's talking about technology, but it's talking about it from a human perspective, and it's hosted by 2 Black folks. And it's told in a way, and it's like under 30 minutes. So it's like a lot of narrow pipes, but the people that are like very big fans of it are really big fans, and it's like, oh yeah, there's an episode, like we're gonna tell a bunch of people about it type thing. And I've kind of been using that for like all my other projects. Like social justice based technology work isn't everyone's cup of tea, but like the people whose cup of tea it is, they will rally behind it, and that ends up being much more rewarding than having something that every single person likes. You know, like a lot of people like Andy Warhol or like Jeff Koons, but you know, it's not everybody's cup of tea. So.
Well, I feel like we're almost dealing with different skills here. Like as a poet in a field that has like very little commercial liability, if anything, like we'd be lucky to get 1,000 people like rallying behind us, much less 100. And like, you know, I had like a chapbook come out over the summer, and like previously in the past, I was like super gung-ho about just like being vocal about promoting all my projects and just like, getting people to submit to my magazine and like getting, posting about my own publications. And then like, I don't know, when this book came out, I was, I posted about it a few times, and it's just like, well, like if people want to buy it, they'll buy it. If not, they won't. And like, it's sort of this similar thing, I guess, where, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, like, especially with something so sort of niche and specialized as poetry. Like, it's not that you want everyone to buy it, like, you want people to just like connect with it and like feel moved by the text. And the person who did the cover, like, the publisher sent her a copy, and then she emailed me a couple weeks later to be like, this like was really moving, like, thank you so much for writing it. And like that was almost like, reason enough to write it. Like, that I felt like super gratified just to do that. So yeah, I guess like the big question there was about like how you find your community. And I think like maybe it's a little different as someone that's not necessarily like trying to make a living out of all these different pieces. Like, hardly anyone's paying rent off their poetry. Like, I have a full-time job that pays me to do development. I'm not like doing freelance with that. And so like it's sort of just, I guess I have the ability to just be like, well, if someone connects with it, if 2 people connect with it, like, that's cool. That's like good enough for me.
Right. Yeah, that's that weird art and commerce blend.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because like me on the other hand, I'm like, all right, I have to make rent.
Yeah.
So,
it's you gotta get funded somehow.
Yeah.
So like, does that like, do you like feel that pressure a lot? Like, does that influence like your day to day?
oof. I feel like I'm lucky that my art practice can be translated into extreme hard skills. Like, I'm very thankful that I know how to create websites and know how to like design applications. And it just happens to be my art practice. So it's much easier to find work because it's like an in-demand skill. Versus like I talk to some of my friends and they're like, I make sculptural conceptual objects and that is all I know how to do. And I'm like, their only option is getting represented by a gallery or, do food service, So it's like, I look at it in that kind of way where, I mean, I have a full-time job, but the hard skills that I know make it easy to find work. But now I'm trying to like kind of adjust it so it's more 50-50 versus like, right now it's more like 80% my design work is paying the bills and then 20% is like hitting up the small bills through like podcast ad sales or online Patreon supporters or donations or those type of things. So
I think you'd be surprised how many artists fall into that percentage, 20% to 80%. I mean, I've worked with, and I was also surprised. I worked with Cody Hudson, who is a quite well-known designer and artist in the city, and through talking with him, he's been making work for 15 or 20 years, fine art work and design work, and he is still at like a 20-30% art income, 70-80% design income. Just super interesting, because you see a lot of these, it's just how people position themselves online. You see a lot of these people. Matthew Hoffman's another great name. It's going to be a lot of Googling probably after this.
Is it that you are beautiful?
Yeah, so he, at one point, 8, 9, 10 years ago when I met him, had a full-time job and had 8 to 10 pseudonyms he was making artwork under, literally. And he, outside perspective, seeing each of these individual pseudonyms, you'd think they were one person that focused 100% on artwork. And that wasn't the case. All his artwork was done after hours, and it was 7 different people. To the point where I would write one, this is before I knew that they were all him, I would write one of his pseudonyms an email, and there would be an email chain between the other pseudonyms of the project, and he would tailor these emails to make it look like they're having conversations within their group of the shared studio.
So it's like a
We're
little solo
digressing
performance
here.
just for you?
Yeah.
Through those emails?
In
Clearly it
theory,
was for
yes.
him.
Yeah. But at this point, and just maybe I think 2 years ago now, he has taken the choice to I think he actually got laid off to commit full time to his art practice, and I can name maybe, well, he's one of them now, but on one hand I could count the people that only sustain their life with making artwork. You know what I mean? And I mean it. How do you define that exactly? It's a big gray area, but most people I know have it. Food industry is a really good one because you can make a lot of money off of tips easily, and it's super flexible. A lot of musicians are in food service, so they can go on tour and stuff. It's how do you supplement that passion project with another source of income? And I mean, once you get to a point where you're making the artwork for the money as well, it actually seems to change the practice and the things that you're making, which can be for better or worse. I mean, I've talked to friends that have moved to New York that feel like they're just on a manufacturing line. They're people come to them to produce paintings just like people are making cars on an assembly line, anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to have that balance between the two and leave the freedom, have a bit more freedom in the artwork to explore and fail a little bit more and to make more interesting things that when you're not wholly reliant on those things creating income for yourself too.
Yeah, I guarantee completely if I didn't have the hard skill of making design work, I would be making a lot more sellable objects. Yeah, I have a couple buddies who were quote unquote new media artists, and then they moved out east where objects are king as far as selling work versus LA where more video and untangible objects, and now they're finding ways their practice has adjusted where their digital methods have become physical objects. And I had a studio visit with one, and he was like, yeah, I mean, when you're thinking about having to sell work now versus Chicago, which is much more social currency based, it's you find a way to adapt your work for the audience.
Yeah. Where do I even go from there? So we're talking about different streams of things you do. Some you do to make ends meet, to fund your other projects, but what keeps you engaged in the projects that don't immediately have any sort of revenue attached to them, or maybe won't ever? What keeps you in it? What's your motivation?
Sorry, that one. I like to use the term using your leftovers a lot when it comes to my practice of making. So the things that don't necessarily generate an income, I know that those are ways to sort of it's weird to create an in into possibly making other forms of income. A good example is weekly I write a newsletter. It's either an essay or a piece of poetry, and 80% of the people that I've worked with for design work have all been introduced through the newsletter. So they've been fans of my writing, they've replied, we've talked, and it's oh, by the way, it's kind of a reminder. It's okay, Monday morning, oh yeah, that guy James, and then they'll reply to the newsletter with, oh, by the way, do you want to take on this website project? So even though it's not a very large revenue generating thing, it's something that keeps people in your mind, and then they notice oh, you're designing an email every week, oh, you know how to write, you know how to communicate. Let's use those things together and form that into a more revenue making product. So it's kind of it's a weird line between advertising and passion project, but it's everything's kind of advertising in the long run. It is. We're all brands.
We're all kind of like what you're talking about, with the newsletter, reminds me of people that just hack on side projects. Obviously people do it because it's fulfilling and it's a good thing to do in and of itself, but it's really helpful to have something in your portfolio so that when people go to your GitHub, they can see public activity and see your work and see what you've been up to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the projects that I do that are not ever going to generate any revenue, I've actually found that the projects I work on myself are harder to sustain versus ones that I'm doing like with a collaborator, because I think like when someone else is like helping build a magazine or build like a publishing room with you, like you feel obligation to the person you're working with, you feel obligation to the people that you're publishing, and so I guess like you know, not just building something that can exist in a vacuum and that exists for its own sake, but like helping like put people's voices out in the world. Like that's something that you know, is important to me, and that sort of helps motivate me and help me like continue to work on things that might otherwise be hard to sustain.
And I'm sure your collaborators have seen all of your voices in a variety of projects and kind of gain like an insight of who you are. And they're like, all right, this person seems really cool. I want to work with them on something. Like going through your Twitter feed. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's nothing exists in a vacuum.
Yeah, even Twitter.
Yeah.
Special.
Especially on Twitter.
So where does collaboration fit into your practice? Rachel kind of started to get into that and how it keeps her in a project, but how else does that really influence the different types of work you're making and how your role maybe changes based on who you're collaborating with?
For me, I used to really lean on that. I used to do a lot of collaborative projects. I have a shared studio that I share with 6 other people, and we do work together under the Post family. And through doing a lot of collaborative projects, I've found that initially it started as collaborating with other people that do similar work to me, which I found fairly difficult to navigate, who kind of like creates the momentum for the project and who develops the aesthetic and who kind of like, there almost has to be one or the other person has to kind of be like the highlight and the other person is the secondary. So for me, the much more rewarding collaborations have been collaborating with people that do something completely different from what I am even capable of doing. So, you know, collaborating with anthropologists who knows how to write grants and has all these ideas about how we interact with the world, and utilizing their knowledge to create some kind of catalyst to make work is way more interesting for me, I feel like, and the outcome tends to be way more interesting as well, because it's no longer like this person and this person creating this thing 50-50. It's like this, it's a whole new identity kind of, you know, and that kind of stuff, you know. And I think even, you know, as having a design background and an advertising background and committing that more to the art world, like I would love to be able to paint. I can't. I don't even know how to hold a brush. Like, I'm just not comfortable doing that. But I am comfortable going to a friend and say, hey, I have this potential commission. I designed these paintings. Will you paint them and I'll pay you to do that? You know, it's like where I think a lot of artists, there's like this authorship that gets really difficult, and the like, oh, if you didn't make it, like, it's not yours. How are you putting your name on it? How are you selling it under your name? And I think, you know, there was a lot of this in conceptual art as well. Like John Baldessari, one of my favorite artists, was really known for like basically paying people to make his paintings. He would come up with the idea, and the idea was the art, and then the painting was just the medium that he decided to execute it. Why spend 20 years trying to figure out how to paint when someone else does it so much better than you, and you're generating income? You could just pay them for their skills and utilize it. And as long as those people are getting paid appropriately, I see no problem with that, you know. But I find for me, like collaboratively working with other people, finding people that have vastly different skill sets for me is way more rewarding than having just a room full of collage artists making a zine, you know?
Wait, what's wrong with that?
Nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's like rewarding. It's rewarding in like the physical act of making it and being in a room with each other, but the end result is like has much less of a lifespan, I feel like, in rewarding wise. Like I feel like the things that I'm making with people that have a different skill set have a longer longevity of like reward for me personally. You know, it's the act of making with those people that are similar to me that I really enjoy, where it's like I do enjoy making with people that have different skill sets, but it's just as rewarding. The object and the people seeing that object afterwards has a little bit more of a lifespan, I feel like. Do you collaborate a lot? Yeah, you do.
Yeah, I try to a lot. A lot. It's digitally most of the time. Yeah, I mean, I enjoy it because it kind of gets me out of my head, and kind of expands like how the work ends up. You know what I mean? I'm thinking of like a recent example.
Are you
I've
allowed
worked-
to talk about your zine yet?
What's up?
Are you allowed to talk about your zine yet or no?
Yeah. What? Yeah.
Wow.
What's up?
Sorry.
Chad just did.
Yeah.
Blow
Yeah.
up the spot.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah. Okay. So good example. I have a zine coming out at the fingers crossed beginning of December, and it's a zine full of writing that I've done, and I'm an alright illustrator, but I cannot letter for shit. But I love like calligraphy, typography, you know. And I was thinking like I usually collaborate when there is a skill that I don't have and I really want to work with somebody. So I collaborated with Von Fender out in Connecticut, and we just like swapped files over Dropbox, and it's like a collaborative zine where he is illustrating the titles and the cover, and it's my writing. So a lot of collaborations for me just come from, I don't have a skill, but I like what you do. I don't know what it is that we will do, and we will make something. So, yeah. Thanks for putting me on the spot. Sorry.
Look out for that in December.
Yeah.
Can we buy it?
Did
Yeah,
Yeah.
you talked about what you do, but you haven't really talked about the subject matter, the what motivates you, what is the content of what you do?
Me
So
personally?
yeah, in other words, you can say I do digital, I've done writing, I've done this, I've done that. I don't know what you write about.
Okay.
What you're creating art about and why that's so significant to you.
Well, a lot of times, like when I'm making art, it usually comes out of a frustration. So it's like a mixture of something that I'm frustrated about or something that I'm anxious about. And it's like if there's something I'm incredibly obsessive
I
about.
need a concrete example.
Yeah, I'm gonna get there. So a good example is I did a new body of work down at the Logan Center at the University of Chicago, and it was all about me processing sort of like the consistent rash of public police brutalities that have been happening, just mainly because it's been fucking me up mentally to like hear about somebody new who's been killed while unarmed. So I'll do a lot of writing, and then it might turn into a visual art piece, which I created, these sort of digital manipulations of press images of dying protests that have been happening. It might turn into a website that I created for that show where guests can come in and write down what they were doing the night of the non-indictment of Darren Wilson. And then that turned into an interactive website that showed their responses in a news ticker. It might turn into, I'm trying to think of another example. Like it's mostly things along that type of line. It's like whatever is frustrating me at the moment, and it gets to the point where it has to be let out as a release is usually how it ends up happening. So in my writing's case, it's whatever I'm obsessively thinking about for the week. And then on Sunday, I write it and I send it out, which is really versatile. So
I think a lot of your work, at least my perspective on it, is like bringing things into conversation that are hard to talk about and that people aren't necessarily talking about on a larger scale, and you feel like internally are bothering you in a way that if you make some work that is influenced by these happenings, that it'll create a larger dialogue around them, right? Like, so you don't feel like the personal burden of these situations and not having this dialogue that you can be a part of and create a larger dialogue within the like the audience that you're showing your work to, in order to just feel more like less of like a singularity within that context, right? And that's what I really admire about your work, especially because I feel like for me, I don't make work like that. Like I don't think I could, honestly, like from my perspective. Like my work is like acting on hunches and being curious about unknown things rather than having these things that are very finite that are happening and reacting to them. You know what I mean? Yeah. The end.
Okay. I'm trying to think of where to go from there. It's so great. It's hard to moderate throwing these questions when we're going in a great place. But we talked a little bit about like Twitter and podcasts and these alternative things that some people might do as like just your social media account or a side project, but they are ultimately a part of what you do. So what do you consider to be content, and is there a hierarchy between printed words and digital ones, tweeted ones?
I was about to say, that's
where do I
your
begin?
wheelhouse right there.
Resident expert.
Resident millennial. So background on that. Some of us know who, I don't even know what she does. She probably works at like an agency or something, but whatever company she works for has like a resident millennial that tells the company like what millennials are into and stuff. And she posted a link to this girl's Instagram, and she of course has like thousands and thousands of followers, like just like very like well postured, like well branded, and I was just like, I'm so intimidated by this. Like this girl just like has her personal brand in place. She's like my age, but she like is like an entity. Like her brand is an entity. But anyway, it was interesting to see the term content creation come up a lot in like the questions I think that fueled this event, because like to me that term is so like commercial. Like content creation is like something that people who are trying to like bump up their SEO do. Like it like feels like a completely different world than like I guess the more creative type of stuff that I'm doing. Like even like tweeting and stuff, like I guess that's nominally content creation, but the tweeting's weird. Like I think that was half of what you were asking about, like what makes that, what was the question again? Like what makes that?
Like is there a hierarchy between things that are posted online, whether that's like Twitter or a blog, and things that are printed?
Yeah, like I think, you know, for a while now there's been a sense that like there's just this like glut of digital content, and that like things that are posted online, like because there's so much content and so much shit online, like are just like inherently somehow worthless. But like I think the sort of flip side of that coin is part of the reason we you know, are people tend to like value print more. Like people approach like print works or print poetry or whatever like in a different way than writing or PDFs they can just access online. And like I don't even know if that's so much like something inherent to the format as like, well, of course, like you think that print stuff is more valuable because like there's just so much digital stuff online. Like it's sort of like this fetishizing and like just aestheticizing of you know, a format that is more sparse and, you know, is harder in certain ways than like digital. But like I think we talked about this at the last panel too, about how like that divide almost, it doesn't make sense to draw that divide, because like the digital and print worlds to me like aren't entirely, you know, separate. Like they're not two separate spheres. Like when you log on, you're not like, you know, entering into some virtual sphere and like putting on a mask and becoming a different person. Like your phone's probably the first thing you look at when you wake up. Like people are using digital devices throughout the day, and so like I think like the hierarchy, if it does exist, and it does in people's minds, like is sort of you know, artificial and is sort of put in place. And I think like in reality, like there's a lot more intermixing that happens. And I'm curious like to hear if James has thoughts on that, especially as someone who like does digital or has like a digital practice.
I mean, I definitely, like, when you said, like, the fetishizing of print, like, I believe you completely on that. And I feel like the reason why those type of medias, like ones that are, quote-unquote, slower moving, are valued more is because there are more gatekeepers that are involved in that, and more forms of validation that are brought upon that, which kind of discounts any form of digital media. I mean, the thing about blogs and the thing about Twitter and the thing about Instagram is anyone can just access that and then put it out into the world without having to check in with anyone first, or, you know, versus like a book or a magazine where it's like, oh, you have to be invited to then write for this place, and then you have to go to an editor that then says this is the stamp of approval to go out into the masses. Or even music back then, where it was like you had to get the acceptance of the label that had to then push it out to the radio, versus now anybody can just go on SoundCloud and put something out. So I feel like it is, as you said, like it's a fetishizing with the quote-unquote good old days, which, you know, we go into a long story of what the good old days actually mean. But like it's pretty much saying like, oh, let's go back to the days when only certain people selected can get their voice out.
Good for who? Right.
What?
Good for who? It was only good for
exactly.
certain.
Yeah.
Is there anything lost? I mean, I've worked with a lot of tremendously talented editors.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's definitely beneficial to have an editor, like for a lot of things, and have folks kind of hone your voice. But I feel like a lot of times those gatekeepers keep out a lot of voices that sometimes need to be heard raw, whether it's music, whether it's art, whether it's words. I'm about to say printed, but published otherwise.
They get vetted though, and I'd be curious about your guys' thoughts of like, where does meaning play a role in when something becomes meaningful, right, in either of those realms, and is therefore elevated and visible, more visible because it's people are finding that it's meaningful, rather than it getting maybe lost in an ocean of digital versus something else. And so obviously there are people who are vetting those, like certain blogs, certain sources that, right, are interested in archiving and promoting. But I like the 1,000. I mean, you touched on that a little bit, that the kind of 1,000, the need for that number, but
I'm just immediately thinking like the meaningful sort of argument of like a good example is when Ferguson Ferguson protests started. In that point, what is more meaningful to you? The tweets and vines from people down there experiencing the things, or the PhD dissertations or talking heads that are distilling something from a more reputable source?
Sure.
Like, what is more meaningful in that case?
Yeah, so then therefore the investment is, or the burden of investing in what's meaningful is subjective, and on the person consuming.
But at the same time, like I think social media networks like sort of structure the incentives that might have certain content like float to the top.
Oh,
like,
sure.
I'm just thinking of like Twitter launched this like moments feature that like has these like news stories, and that like weaves together like tweets and vines and stuff like that. and like there's these very visible markers of like faves or likes or whatever, that, you know, like literally the algorithm like is built upon like surfacing, you know, things that might be more popular, and so
So unlike every sphere does that.
oh, what's
The
that?
art world does the same kind of filtering.
But yeah,
And it happens at in everyone's discipline, everyone's sphere, right?
yeah, for the most
To a
part.
certain degree.
I mean, like, I can't remember that website. I was gonna make a pun on Moments, but I just thought of that one website. You might know what it is. I just had my mind blown. It's like it's like an arts website just for buyers and curators. So it's actually like it's like a live ranking system.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, and this
Yeah.
this is a totally different tangent.
Yeah.
that I don't even know if I want to get into, but basically,
Hack that site.
there's this website that you can go to that ranks artists based on buy the artwork, hold the artwork, or sell the artwork, right?
And
Oh
cuteness.
Yeah.
And that like my professor usually
It
They might
goes,
as well.
it goes by,
It's not a piece of conceptual art itself.
I'm positive, and this is why.
Could be.
The whole idea
That
of
would
this
be
thing
great.
is they release this list, and if you are able to afford it, you purchase the list before it's released to the public. And you act on that list. You sell the artwork that they say needs to be sold, you buy the artwork that needs to be sold, inherently making that list true once it's released to the public. So they're basically creating their own market.
The art market is like legalized insider trading.
Absolutely
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
I have so many feelings right now. But I think there's a lot of that happening in like different ways with online content too. You know, like it is this completely open sphere where anyone could put in their input and have it be heard by a wider audience, but there still are gatekeepers that are involved.
Mhm.
I think the thing about digital compared to print for me is like the shareability of it and the way as it can move so much faster, whereas like before the internet you would have to hand this physical book to someone and it would take a lot longer to get in front of the amount of eyes that are now seeing it digitally. Yeah, there still are those gatekeepers. They're just different ways of going about that online because the market moves so much faster now because it's so shareable.
Yeah,
You know.
Yeah, like there are semi gatekeepers with Moments. It's not completely algorithmically set. It's also like there are a set of curators in Twitter's payroll that are picking and choosing. Okay,
Well, frankly, I would prefer the human curator to the algorithmic curator every time.
how come?
Because it's scary. If what you're seeing is a filter bubble that is programmed to just pick up certain things, it can't go beyond itself. So you know what the filter bubble is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if I look at Google, you look at Google, we get two different things because of the machine learning that's been going on.
Mhm.
So we might not see the same information. If we rely on algorithms to determine what we see of the world, and therefore how we determine what we think of the world, then the machine's won.
But also, like, the algorithms aren't just like self-sufficient entities. Like, the algorithms were coded by humans and they
but at
reproduce
what
the
point-
biases.
but at what
So
point do they take off and not need them? I mean, that's really a big issue right now with AI.
Well, I think it comes down to trust, really. Like, if I mean, there are some people that I distrust as much as I distrust an algorithm because of the things that they're putting together, and I think this could even be brought into like an art context of the idea of like paying someone else in order to create something for you, kind of like you have to establish this relationship with the curator almost in order to feel that you are comfortable with them curating what you're looking at. You know, like if you're reading book reviews in the New York Times and there's this person that you're always reading because you enjoy their perspective and you know the stuff that they like is the stuff that you like, and you grow that relationship. But I do think also like there's issues with both. Like if you are static in the individual or the algorithm that you're interacting with, it's only going to show you the things that you're going to like. So you have to go out of your way to find different avenues of content in order to have a wider view of what is going on. And for me, I feel like, and I think criticism comes down to this a lot, and I feel this very strongly for my work, is like if I instill a strong reaction to my work, negative or positive, I've done my job. If people are kind of like, cool, move on to the next thing, that's not good enough for me. If I get a negative review of a show that someone feels like they need to put energy into telling more people about why they hate it, I'm instilling action in someone in conversation around what I'm making, So I think there's, with digital content versus print content and the curators that we're going through, machine versus person, I think there's problems in both of them. I think there needs to be more crossing of streams and more efforts within us individually to like not just look at the things that we know we're going to like all the time, or just like hyper focusing on these things that are going to give us that like chemical reaction in our brain that just say keep going. Like we need things that are going to question the actions that we're making, and the only way we do that is by like changing the way that we're looking at things and looking for different things and not relying on those curators in order to bring those to our eyes,
I think also, that's an interesting notion about the filter bubble, and that I think that has brought on some of the highest sought after commodity today is authenticity, which is kind of like an oxymoron, the authenticity commodity. But that's what like people feel they will pay more for something that's more authentic, even though knowing it's still commodification of this thing that's supposed to be separate from the term. So even like with streaming music services, like people tend to go, or again, I'm generalizing somewhat, but music playlists that are curated by humans rather than like by an algorithm. Spotify, like a lot of it was curated by an algorithm, and personally I kept getting same suggestion. I got bored of it. Then they came out with these new playlists that are now curated by humans. I'm like, oh, I'm kind of going more towards that.
Is that the discovered ones?
Yeah,
so those
exactly.
Those are human generated?
I believe so. That, but they also think sometimes they have they invite like curators or whatever, an artist to curate a playlist.
Yeah,
Well, this is interesting though, but do you feel like you're relating to those things more because you know that they're humans?
It's a weird psychological thing, and it's like you don't know where it starts and ends.
Right?
Yeah.
But to go back to what you're saying about Ferguson, to me, it's not an either or issue. I really do want to read the analysis by someone who's been looking really broad at historical contexts and deeper issues than can come out in a tweet. But what's going to come out in that tweet is the passion and the immediacy and the thoughts, right and wrong, of the moment. So it's kind of like I want it all.
Totally.
Yeah.
I absolutely
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, and I think, and this is one thing that kind of going full circle here back into the art realm of like the immediacy versus longevity. I think about this a lot with the kind of work that I'm making, where like I'm disappointed when these singular things that I'm making don't live up to my expectations, whether it's a show, the sales from a show, or something I publish doesn't sell, or things like that. And I have to keep reminding myself that like the only thing for me that matters is the longevity of it. Am I going to be able to make like a living off of my practice for a long period of time? That has nothing to do with these individual compartmentalized things that I'm doing. It's within a context of like, this is a body of work. This is, we need those sporadic reactions to things as well as this super thoughtful, long-term kind of projection or analysis of how history kind of puts into context what we're making in order to keep that momentum going, and to be well informed and to really be excited about making again.
I think to add to that though, I think to put some terms to it for me, I've been really intrigued by our kind of embracing wholeheartedly of this kind of velocity, right, of things, the speed. We need the speed,
Yeah.
and we need the efficiency that comes with that, and we're seduced by it so intensely at this moment that that the deeper questioning is extremely hard to get to because it's very it's become physical at this point. And I think I worry often that I'm incapable on some level without some deep shift in my life to escape some of those desires. Especially the efficiency and the need to like deliver things quickly, get them out to the masses. Those kind of things are so seductive that putting those in competition is almost the problem.
Yeah,
Because
totally.
they're not attempting to be efficient in the same ways, but they're killing one another.
Yeah, totally. Well, it comes down to like, how do you define efficiency too? Do you define efficiency based on the time that it takes you to do it, or the longevity of that solution?
Well, our planet generally does.
Right.
And it's time based,
Right.
the velocity
Right.
and speed being tethered to time. But if we're gonna say like spiritual growth, there's not a whole lot of room
that's
for
interesting.
I have to circle back to something that Chad said, and I think it ties in with this point that was just made. When you were talking about the strong reaction, like the hate or love or whatever, but strong reaction, which is probably the most typical hope I hear from artists, is they want that big engagement. And your description of the thing that wasn't the big engagement was men. Where I've been
Was what? I'm sorry.
men.
Oh, yeah.
Where I'm looking for another alternative, I think, which is where you sort of just nestle in there. You just sort of move in gently. You just sort of get in there and live with the person. And I don't know how possible that is, but I've been looking at that goal. I've never had to try to articulate it before. That's why I'm sort of, didn't realize this is what I was looking for. But seeing it now in contrast to that often stated, looking for the big, get to people's past.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, and are you making more functional objects as well, or not necessarily?
Narrative objects.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question to sort of pull all of this together.
Good luck.
So, you will be surprised. The overarching theme was as a blank, I blank, and we've gone into this discussion that James brought up about gatekeepers and access, and I think an interesting conversation that people have brought up in other places as well is like, when can you call yourself a blank? With access to software or the internet, you can make a work of art or a piece of design or post something online, and I feel like there's a lot of contention about whether having software makes you a designer or having a blog makes you a writer, and I think that that's like a new version of gatekeeping almost, and I wanted to know what your opinions are on that, both when you feel someone can claim this title and why that may or may not be important.
I feel so many qualms about the whole, like, I am a blank, like, I get to be blank. Like, it's definitely created, like, just angst, I guess, in me, where, like, it's like, I'm writing stuff, like, I'm publishing stuff, but I don't feel like a poet, I feel like an interloper, I feel like an outsider, like, I am interested in this, but I didn't study creative writing in college, like, I have all of these other things, and so, like, I just, like, do I get to use this term? And I think, like, a lot of times I see people making fun of this whole, like, am writing hashtag on Twitter or Instagram, where, like, people will write, like, post a picture of their latte and just be like, am writing. And then there's, like, NaNoWriMo, where, like, people are writing novels, which is really cool and something that's probably a lot of people's goals, but, like, then people, like, make fun of the shitty writing that might be produced, but it's not necessarily produced out of the whole project. And I think, like, I don't know, like, it can be difficult and problematic to try to, like, seek external validation of, like, what, might, at least in my case, like, what might make you a writer. Like it might be different in other fields, but like the best sort of thing I've heard that just sort of helped like quiet my fears was like, okay, like, are you writing? Like, are you writing with like some amount of frequency? Like, do you write? Like, then you're a writer. Like, great.
Yeah,
that's
like,
it.
is a shitty writer still a writer? Well, yeah, you call them a shitty writer, so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
but
like,
they're it.
yeah, and people love to like, you know, like throw out that term like, what do you do? I'm a writer. Okay, but like, what do you really do? Like, people, like there's just like there's this like weird like status in like sort of like, you know, terming yourself in this way, and like it's like signaling, I guess. It's a way of signaling more than anything, and so like that comes with all the like pitfalls of signaling. But I think maybe like the answer for me is to try to like, you know, like turn down the amount of external validation or input that determines who I am, and like find that more from internal sources.
I mean, I think I'm super interested in this point you just made. It's like there's the act of writing, right? And then there's being a writer. And I'm just stumbling upon this, so I'm having a hard time like putting into words what exactly that is. But yes, like if you have Photoshop and you opened it for 5 minutes and put something in it, you are designing. Therefore, you are a designer in that moment. You know, if you're writing, if you're physically writing something, you are a writer. You know, and I'm curious as to like what takes it from the act of writing to being a writer. Like, is it thinking about the writing when you're not doing it, or is it thinking about the designing when you're not doing it? Like what's the
external recognition? I feel like.
Well, I think
yeah, that's interesting.
Like,
yeah.
Well, the way I kind of look at it is like the most accessible definition for me is photographer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, probably 90% of us in here have Instagram in our pockets, and we might see something that looks interesting, and we compose a nice picture, and we upload it. But do we call ourselves a photographer? When in reality, that is what we just did. We performed the act of photography. And I feel like the biggest blend between that is the commercial part of it. You know,
are you paid to do
yeah,
that
a photographer has been paid to do said thing.
Interesting.
You
Yeah.
can be engaged in a dialogue, though, a discourse, a historical engagement with photography, and not have an education or a job or any of those things. So I totally agree with everything you're saying, except we
But
are
payment is-
entering.
Yeah, yeah.
We are
Payment
entering
is
a stream of conversation in the world because we are in a body public, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everything therefore is, yeah. So
Yeah, I know.
sorry, I won't go on
people-
that rant, but
Yeah, I know
yeah,
people that
It's
like
definitely
have
a teacher, right? He's a teacher.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. You do photography.
Right.
Anybody can do photography.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's a
Absolutely.
perfect example. Like
Yeah.
I know somebody who isn't a photographer by trade,
Yeah.
and might be a good way to put it. But they take really good photos for Instagram, and they have a large
And
like
there's
follow
totally
count.
room in the world for that.
Yeah, and and it's good enough where brands come to them and pay them to like.
Sure.
Could it be intentionality though, in a way, where it's sort of like a
Yeah.
purposeful intentionality of taking photographs? Whether like, I mean, there's that argument, right? Like, well, you know, you can write a shopping list, but you're not a writer, right? You know, that whole thing. So it's like, if you're intentionally trying to practice writing or sort of like actually sort of looking towards that, then is that the distinction in which you can feel a little bit better about, not a little better, or like you are sort of taking a step in owning that label yourself, right?
I feel
so
like
it doesn't
I feel like-
necessarily have to be tied to commerce,
Yeah.
but it can be tied about sort of an owning
Right, and I
of
think
your
that
label
kind
for
of goes
yourself.
like what Rachel was talking
Yeah.
about, where the label comes when you own it.
Right. Yeah.
You can accidentally be making an Instagram that's a riff on Baldessari, and not
Yeah.
and not have the intention of wanting that to be critiqued and thought about in terms of
Right.
Baldessari's discourse, but
Yeah.
it's still a reference and derivative of Baldessari.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's
Yep.
also being like in a critical engagement with a practice
Absolutely.
Right.
and knowing what's going on, and having like a response to something that's a body of work that is photography, and not necessarily just snapping photos or
Critical engagement is absolutely the thing. I feel like it's like
Yeah,
defining.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right, I feel like we could continue this thread forever, but we have other discussions.
tag in.
Which is
Yeah.
great.
Let's
So thank you, everyone. Let's just take a quick refresh, like use the restroom, grab another beverage, and then we'll transition to the next panel.
I like that. That's
Great.
Nice work, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Job.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun.
You're up.
Yeah. I'll say we should just like fit the exact same
Right
place.
there, right?
It just, I think we should.
Yeah, we're just gonna. I'm in James' spot.
Yeah.
Okay.
I really like
Website has like Rachel.
like that was just like that almost like,
Good job. I was about to be like, but would you consider yourself a post-structuralist?
oh man, I did not. Oh, I didn't even write it in there. Damn it.
Yeah. I want to know what your engagement with your structuralism.
so we're just